Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. The year gone by will be remembered by most farmers as an excellent year for tillage farmers. However, the year wasn't without its ups and downs in terms of weather and other events, so in this podcast we'll take a look back at 2021 and how it treated tillage farmers. I'm delighted to be joined today by Shay Phelan and Ciaran Collins, both tillage specialists in Teagasc, to look back on the highs and lows through 2021. Gentlemen, you're both very welcome. Ciaran, I want to come to you first, and maybe we can recap a little bit as regards to crops and how they went into the ground in the autumn of 2020.
Yeah, I suppose, Michael, ultimately we did achieve a very good area, like between wheat, barley and oats. They were all, barley was up at 67,000 hectares, oats in around 14 and wheat at 56 thereabouts, So I suppose crops got planted in the autumn, but it wasn't an easy autumn, and it was a far cry from, we'll say, the autumn that we've had this year, It was, it was cool, wet, and, there were sort of patchy sowing opportunities, but I suppose ultimately it all did get done, and I suppose in reasonably good conditions, you could say,
Okay, so then we had crops that were looking pretty well for the most part heading into the winter. How did it come out of the winter? Was there any issues in terms of waterlogging or other kind of damage coming out?
Again, almost despite the weather in some ways, because, November was mild, but particularly in the south, actually, it was very wet. And the last cereals were sown there in sort of early November, and there wasn't anything sown after that, especially in the south where it was quite wet. It was more normal in the northeast. But I remember December was cool and wet, and windy as well. And, January was something similar. So, I suppose the establishment was generally good. Now, there was certainly some waterlogging in that, but in general, I think crops came out of the winter in reasonably good shape.
Okay, so you had relatively full crops kind of from ditch to ditch for the most part. But we had that
in the most part, Michael, yeah. And I suppose, look, we started off the spring, it was, I suppose, January, February, there wasn't any field work done, but March then became very dry and mild. And as we remember, then April was really cool, and growth was a bit slow there for a while,
okay. So Shay, I might just bring you in there. And as Ciaran mentioned, we had this very cool start off to the spring and thinking about the spring plantings. How did that affect the spring plantings and the establishment thereafter?
Yeah, as you say, Michael, as Ciaran rightly said, it was cool and relatively dry in March and April, and it continued into May. Actually, it was actually quite cool in May as well. But from the point of view of planting, I suppose for most guys, certainly in the Midlands area anyway, there was a kind of a week of opportunity at the beginning of March where there was quite a bit of planting done actually. We had a couple of dry days, and guys certainly on lighter soils made use of the opportunity to get some of those fields planted. But for the bulk of the spring cereals, if you like, or the spring crops, planting really didn't start until probably the last 10 days of March, and it continued then into April. And as you went further up the country into some of that heavier ground, you went further into April even still. So for the most part, they went in relatively good dry conditions, and most crops got rolled straight after drilling and so on and so forth. And where people were applying pre-emergence herbicides onto the likes of field beans or peas, that they were able to do that quite readily. I suppose the problem that a lot of guys encountered was that kind of slow emergence and early growth, and especially for something like spring barley, where you need kind of warm temperatures and the season warming up and soils warming up as they begin to grow and tiller. So for a lot of those crops, the spring barley crops in particular, they struggled, and particularly the later you drill them, the more they tended to struggle during that early period. And I suppose what typified a lot of it was we saw quite a few stresses in crops, particularly trace element stresses, and guys were applying a lot of trace elements to those crops in that early period.
So Shay, was that to do with the dry conditions, or was that to do with how cold it was, or a bit of both?
A bit of both, I would imagine, Michael. That they just didn't seem to get up and get going, even though particularly spring barley, especially the malting guys, would have nitrogen on quite early, as soon as they actually can see the tram lines to get them going. Some of those crops just didn't seem to get there, or to get going as quickly as you would like. So they were trying to encourage them along with trace elements to trying to get them to tiller, especially in that crucial tillering period in late April, early May, where it was quite dry. It was cool, so crops were under quite a bit of pressure at that stage. But as I say, thankfully later on in the season, it got a bit kinder, and they managed to catch up.
So Ciaran, can I go back to you? Just switching back around to again those cool, dry conditions in terms of the winter crops. Did that affect, or maybe even the spring crops, I suppose, but did that affect field work in terms of trying to get some of the agronomic inputs applied to those crops? And I suppose maybe the other side of that then, was there, if it was difficult, was there any damage done at that stage?
Yeah, it was difficult, certainly. And I suppose from memory, really, the late frosts were the big issue at the time, and that certainly for applying the likes of growth regulator on some of the winter cereals, that was certainly a factor. And, there were cases where people, I remember just didn't do it. And even if you work all the ways into, I remember even final growth regulators on winter barley, there was certainly a question at the time because the nights were so cold. So certainly it did impact on field work. Funnily enough, in terms of disease in barley, while it was a little bit Syrinco early in the season, I suppose the dryness really, we had relatively clean crops, which was a positive of the weather. No, we did have yellow rust in winter wheat, and that was certainly a feature. But then Septoria, particularly early in the season, wasn't a massive challenge. So I suppose overall, look, the disease levels were generally, I would say, low for the most part of the season.
Okay. And in terms of the damage you mentioned there a second ago, I know there was some talk of a bit of damage to oats. Was that generally widespread, or was it confined a bit?
I'd say it was confined, Michael. I know there were some cases reported in the media and that, and certainly there was damage done to those crops. But I suppose, when you look at the harvest yields, winter oats had a record yield overall. So I suppose the impact, overall was probably quite small. One noticeable thing, I suppose, while winter barley again had an excellent year, there were certainly some areas, particularly in the south, where some of those yields were a little bit disappointing. And possibly that was to do with some late frosts in more advanced crops at the time, maybe where the grains per year maybe wasn't where it should be. But again, look, winter barley had a great year, and they were probably limited enough cases, I would say, Michael.
Okay. And talking about oats then, we had a new scheme this year, Ciaran, the Straw Incorporation scheme, and oats were certainly featured very heavily in that. How well was that taken up? And I suppose looking at it back now through the year with the straw that was incorporated into the soil and that, would we consider it, or is it considered, I suppose, maybe a success?
I would think in general terms it would have been considered a success, I suppose, and we have a lot to learn about, incorporation, I suppose, and particularly can be difficult. We have high volumes of straw like we had this year, and getting a good even spread across the combine header width and getting that incorporated afterwards. But I think the scheme could be regarded as a success in terms of there was 10 million available, and 8.5, 9 million of that was actually spent. So farmers looked for it, and it was there. I suppose the other thing that I think demand and supply were kind of well matched this year as well. And I would feel personally that the Straw Incorporation scheme didn't really create any deficit in the market, and that was probably a concern when you introduce a scheme like this. So I think overall, in terms of as a support to the Irish tillage farmer, and also, in terms of the soil health benefits of chopping straw, I think it could be regarded as a success.
And I don't think I heard too many farmers giving out about the difficulty incorporating it or getting the next crops in or that kind of thing either.
No, in general, I don't think it was an issue. Some people maybe where they had catch crops or that so, and found that, with the shallow cultivations, maybe some of the catch crops didn't establish maybe as they would like. But again, I think there's a bit of a learning process there in that, there was high volumes of straw this year. And, I suppose just getting as I said already, just getting it spread and incorporated correctly can be a challenge sometimes.
Okay. And Shay, just coming back to the year in the background, I suppose, if we were to look back at maybe this time last year, the grain prices were probably, I don't know, probably 40, 50, maybe even 60 euros a ton less than we are, or we could be quoted this year. But in the background, those grain markets started to rise, I suppose, from the start of the year. How tempted were farmers to sell grain forward? And do you think there was much done, I suppose, by the time people got to harvest?
Yeah, it was one of those peculiar years, Michael, where, as you rightly say, there were forward prices offered to growers this time last year, and there's a small uptake on it, I suppose, apart from maybe some people on malt and barley who, in a lot of cases, maybe would have forward sold maybe 10, 15, even 20% of their allocated tonnage that they were going to grow. They would have forward sold at this time last year. And there was quite a bit of uptake of that at that stage. But as you rightly say, throughout the spring, um, prices started to rise, and they continued to rise all during the spring. And I suppose the one difficulty, or one thing that farmers always find difficult to do, is to sell into a rising market, no different than anybody else. So I think while some guys may have taken a small bit of the prices during the spring, most I think would have left them there till they saw how they were going, getting closer to harvest. And I would say most people at this stage, or during the year, left the bulk of their crop to sell at harvest. And for, I suppose, it's the one year out of the last 6 or 7 or 8 years that it actually paid to do so. Normally, you would see the trend going the other way as close as you get to harvest, and shortly after harvest, the price actually drops. But this was one of those few years whereby it paid them to not sell anything until harvest time. Now, whether that's an indication for years for the future is another thing entirely. But certainly this year, it did pay them to leave it there.
I suppose what comes to mind there, Shay, is like all the financial products that you hear about on the radio. It generally comes up with past performance is no indicator of future performance.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Could well be a scenario here. Shay, I want to just jump back a little bit, maybe into the agronomic growing season, and Ciaran mentioned just a little bit. Just in terms of the overall disease, how are we going to look back on 2021? Was it a high year, a low year? Did farmer practice, was that pretty good, or were we just, I suppose, benefit from the weather that happened all the way through the year?
Yeah, I think, as Ciaran said, Michael, the disease pressure, if you take that as one topic in itself, it was a low year, and that's predominantly because we had a dry start to the spring, and disease spread of the spring was quite slow, apart from maybe a bit of rincosporium in winter barley. But as we went through April, we got a very dry April for most parts of the country, which was well below normal, and that generally sets the scene for, if you're going to have a high disease year. Now, May actually turned out to be quite wet, but luckily enough, we were able to get a lot of the work done in the windows that we got at the time. So any spraying that needed to be done was done. But that said, with the few exceptions, like yellow rust was a big problem for some growers this year, especially in the northeast and the drier parts of the country where they had susceptible varieties. Whereas down in Cork, they certainly, on the south, they probably would have had more pressure from septoria on winter wheat. But in general, I would say most crops were a lot cleaner. Certainly, looking at oats, I don't remember a year where I saw as little disease on oats as I've seen this year. So I would say overall, given it was a tricky year to get work done, given the cold and everything that Ciaran has said already, I would think most guys would look back at it fairly favorably and say that they got work done when they needed to get it done, even though it probably wasn't the same pressure as we would have seen over the years.
Okay. And maybe just to square out the year, Ciaran, just in terms of the agronomic side of the house, there was issues around blackgrass that were, I suppose, we in Teagasc and others were trying to hide all the way through the season, and there was an issue certainly around Oak Park, and you might remind us about that. But also in Oak Park, there was the open day there, and maybe you might give us maybe just one highlight that you kind of thought that growers should really bring away from that, or maybe even from your own point of view.
Yeah, I suppose, as you mentioned, the blackgrass one, where it turned up in a wildflower mix in Oak Park, and thanks to the vigilance of the farm manager, John Hogan, there for copying it, And I suppose that just, for me, I suppose really that we just need to be aware of the issue of blackgrass all the time and where it can turn up, and walking our crops, and particularly in June and July before harvest, It's zero tolerance weed. We just, we can't have any threshold there, and I suppose, and that was highlighted strongly at the open day as well, in fairness. I suppose in terms of a highlight for me from the open day, and I'm going to pick the stand I was on, because I think, we're in an era where IPM, integrated pest management, is just so important. And I think it's kind of heartening to see some of the IPM methods that are available to us now, or that are in development, I should say, really, like the suction towers in terms of monitoring aphid flight and that. So, you know, that, and we know that in time we'll be able to give farmers assurances, or, you know, that look, they're, you know, in terms of when aphids start moving and that, as to whether they need to apply an insecticide and that. So I think that would have been a kind of a highlight for me in terms of an IPM measure that's becoming available to farmers.
Okay. And then we kind of slip into harvest, and I think a lot of people would probably look back on it with, I suppose, an eye to was probably a relatively easy harvest. But maybe, Ciaran, you might maybe trace through that harvest. Was it all that good, or was there a bit stop-starty?
Yeah, I suppose, look, the proof of the pudding was we produced, you know, 2.3 million tons from, I think is around 274,000 hectares there of cereals, which was exceptional. I mean, we started with winter barley, you know, yields were excellent. I think the overall average yield was 9.4 tons per hectare there. You know, all crops yielded above the 5-year average, you know, as I said already, with a record yield for winter oats. I mean, winter wheat at 10.8 tons. So look, as Shay kind of said there, the wet and windy May, you know, fills the barns, and that sort of came through this year, I think, combined with a lot of other things. You know, weather was in our favour, and certainly disease pressure was low. In terms of a harvest, I mean, we've got to the harvest a lot of years, you know, with good potential, and we've lost a lot of that through difficult weather, particularly in the month of August. And this year, thankfully, you know, we had really good harvest weather. I mean, some of the winter barley was harvested down as low as 14% moisture. So, you know, I think overall it was a relatively easy harvest. The weather was kind, you know, and then straw was gathered and baled without too much additional cost as well. So one to remember, I think, Michael.
Okay. So Shay, everyone had a smile on their face by the time they were finished harvest. This rolled in reasonably well into the planting season. You might maybe just bring us through that in terms of, was there any great difficulties, or was it again one of those years that might be remembered for, geez, it all went to plan?
Yeah, I suppose while the harvest report or the output that we were seeing this year, Michael, shows that we produced about 2.3 million tons, which, as Ciaran said, most crops were above the 5-year average. There was huge fluctuations within that, and I suppose while most people certainly would have been happy with the harvest, there would have been guys who would have, you know, had different fields who, for whatever reason, just didn't perform as well as they would have liked. And I certainly know that early in the spring barley harvest, there were certainly some crops that weren't as good as people would have liked. So while in general the whole country would have been happy, if you like, with the harvest that they had, there were incidences where our crops that just weren't as good as what you would like. But that said, as you say, most fellas then turned around and I suppose they drilled their catch crops or whatever it is, and most of those got off to a great start and are looking quite well now. And that continued on into September. September was by and large a very dry and warm month. And from about the middle of September on, we started to hear stories about drills starting to roll and guys starting to get some of that winter crops established. And that continued apace right through September and into October. And I would say that for a lot of guys, they finished drilling this year earlier than they'd ever done before. And certainly, like even crops like potatoes, where guys were trying to get out potatoes, that didn't seem to hold them up, with the exception of guys up in the north. The lifting of potato crops didn't seem to delay guys planting at all. And I would say, by and large, most guys had pretty much all the crops drilled, rolled, and in a lot of cases sprayed by the middle of October, which is unheard of. So those crops are now looking quite well. For the most part, they're well established. There are a few cases of damage, be it with slugs and things like that, but for the most part, those crops are looking quite well now.
So Shay, the fertilizer prices started to rise, I suppose, towards the early autumn. But obviously there was good prices as well for grain as well. Do you think either of those factors affected farmers' intentions or what they actually did plant at the end of the day?
There was two things that happened, Michael. I suppose guys, as we said, were in a kind of buoyant mood after the harvest that has just gone out. So they generally that kind of frames the mind as to what they're going to do for the coming crops. So crops that would have performed well, as we know, winter barley and winter wheat and winter oats performed quite well, as Ciaran has said earlier on. So guys were going to always drill them. And I suppose for the most part, guys would have had the seed ordered and received by probably the middle of September. And once the seed ordered and bought, they were committed to drilling it then. And I suppose that the problem then was that fertilizers prices, we knew they were higher than where they had been for the most part in 2021. But it's only since, I suppose, they started drilling that the prices of fertilizers have really risen to the level where they're at the moment. And I think guys now are kind of in that kind of undesirable position where the crops are now drilled, but now they're having to go back and look at the fertilizer that they need to apply to put on those crops to get them to harvest next year. And that's where the crux of the matter is at the moment, that whether it would have made any difference or not if guys had known the prices that were there that were there now, that were going to be there when they started drilling, whether that would have affected planting at the time, I'm not sure. I don't think it would, but certainly it's not desirable, I suppose, to have the fertilizer prices where they are now. But I suppose the only thing that is offsetting that is the grain price at the moment. And I do know of some guys who are forward selling at the moment and are continuing to take a little bit. I know there's Boort Malta and a couple of other companies have come out with relatively good forward prices for next year, and that certainly has alleviated those fertilizer increases. So for the most part, I suppose guys are, yes, they're not happy with the fertilizer prices, but any of them that are availing of the high grain prices have mitigated against those to some extent.
And of course, there was one crop there that seems to have jumped in acreage in comparison to everything else, which is oilseed rape. Considering the price was there, it's a hungry kind of crop though. But how will that keep going for the year, Shay?
We reckon that there's about 25% increase in the area of winter oilseed rape that's been planted this year. And again, thankfully, the autumn has been very kind to that crop in particular. And we have large canopies on that. But the critical thing is from now until early February or mid-February into early March, and how that crop comes out of the winter at that stage. And as we know, if you have a crop there with a good green cover on it, or a GAI of 1.5 or 2, whatever it is, you can actually cut down on the amount of fertilizer nitrogen that you need to apply to that crop. So it is one of those crops whereby there is a positive, given a significant positive, given the growth that it's had over the last couple of months, in that you could see crops next year which mightn't need very much fertilizer at all, or certainly would have an awful lot less fertilizer required, nitrogen fertilizer, that is, than would normally be the case.
Okay, a positive story there, certainly.
Absolutely.
For both of you, for Ciaran and Shay, I might just ask both of you maybe to look at maybe one or two highlight or standout areas that you'll remember 2021 for. Maybe Shay, you might go first.
Yeah, I suppose, look at Michael, it's one of those few years as a tillage grower whereby I would say, with the exception of the cool weather in the spring, that all the ducks lined up for tillage farmers, and that they got good prices, good yields, and good harvesting conditions, which are critical as well. We've often seen years where we've had bumper crops, but we've had struggle to harvest them. So that for me is the standout for the year, and obviously that has a huge impact then on the financial rewards at the end of it. So people had a very lucrative year this year for the most part.
Okay, Ciaran, I presume yours is something similar, but do you have anything else that you?
Yeah, you can't go away from weather and price. I mean, they were the two things, and I think, as Shay says, the weather just fell right in the spring in terms of May, and then we got the good weather in the harvest, and even down to it being cold and cool in November, December, January, which, any untreated crops didn't suffer from BYDV. So it kind of was in our favour the whole way. And look, the price we got this year was obviously way above average. So you mean positives all around there.
Okay, and for me, I think there might be one other one, which I think is a general acceptance in the industry that blackgrass is an issue. And that's it. It's if you have it, you do need to control it, and there's no point in trying to hide it under the bushel. You just need to control it, and certainly there's lots of help available there to help people out of that. Guys, I'm really delighted that you could join me and have a look at the review of 2021. You certainly highlighted the major areas all the way through the year, and as you say, it'll be remembered as a good one, as I say. Ciaran and Shay, thanks very much for joining me.
No problem, Michael.
So that's it for the Tillage Edge, and my thanks to Ciaran and Shay for joining me on the podcast. In a couple of weeks, we'll look forward to 2022 and discuss what the year may bring, so listen out for that one. Finally, don't forget, if you like the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening. I'll be back with you next week with more tillage news and advice.